41 years on this bench have taught me that the smallest cases sometimes carry the heaviest truths. I have sentenced men who stole millions without blinking. I have listened to confessions that would keep most people awake for the rest of their lives. But nothing prepared me for an 11-year-old boy standing in my courtroom, accused of stealing a diamond ring he had walked 3 blocks out of his way to return. My clerk placed the file on my desk that morning with a look I have come to recognize over the years, the look she gives me when a case does not sit right with her before I have even opened the folder. State vs. Noah Bennett. Petty theft. Possession of stolen property. The defendant was listed as 11 years old. I read that line twice before I reached for my glasses, because in 4 decades of criminal law, an 11-year-old facing formal theft charges over a piece of jewelry is not something that crosses my desk often, and when it does, there is almost always a story underneath it that the charging paperwork does not tell. Noah Bennett was removed from his birth mother's custody at the age of 4. His mother struggled with addiction in a way that made consistent caregiving impossible. There was no father listed on his birth certificate. When the state removed him, he had been living for several weeks on cereal and whatever kindness his mother's neighbors were willing to extend through a cracked apartment door. A caseworker who has since retired described him in her intake notes as a child who did not cry when he was taken, which she flagged as unusual and troubling, because most children cling and scream. Noah simply picked up the single plastic bag that held his belongings and walked out to the car without being asked twice. He had already learned at 4 years old that holding on to things rarely worked out well for him. What followed were 7 years inside the foster care system, for different placements. 2 of them ended not because of anything Noah did, but because the households themselves became unstable. A 3rd placement, when Noah was 7, ended after 6 months when the foster parents reported that they were, in their words, not equipped to handle a child with his level of emotional withdrawal. I read that phrase in the file and felt something tighten in my chest, because I have sat across from enough traumatized children in my career to know exactly what emotional withdrawal looks like from the outside, and exactly how much pain it is covering on the inside. His 4th and final placement was with a woman named Denise Carter, a 53-year-old former elementary school teacher who had been fostering children for 11 years. Denise ran what she called a full house and a fuller heart, 3 foster children living with her at any given time in a modest 3-bedroom home. Noah later said her house smelled like cinnamon and clean laundry, 2 smells he said he had never associated with any place he lived before hers. Denise was the one seated beside him in my courtroom that morning, and the way she sat beside that boy told me everything about the kind of woman she was before she ever said a word. The morning of the incident began, according to every account given, as an entirely unremarkable Saturday. Denise had taken Noah and 2 other children currently in her care to Meridian Square, a shopping and dining complex, for their monthly errand day, grocery shopping, second-hand clothing, and if the month's finances allowed it, a shared plate of fries at the food court. Noah was wearing a jacket Denise had bought second-hand 2 winters earlier, one that no longer fully covered his wrists because he had grown 4 inches in 18 months, and Denise, stretching a fixed foster stipend across 3 children, had not yet been able to replace it. While Denise compared prices on canned vegetables 2 aisles over, Noah wandered toward the restroom corridor near the food court, a corridor covered by 4 separate security cameras. It was there on the tiled floor beneath a bench that he found a ring. He would later describe it to me directly, and I want to share his exact account because the ring itself needs to be understood first. It was a platinum band set with a round center diamond just under 2 carats, flanked by 2 smaller baguette-cut stones, later appraised at just over $47,000. It was not costume jewelry. It was, by every visual and material measure, an extraordinarily valuable object, sitting alone on the floor of a public mall, dropped by a woman who did not yet know it was gone. Noah picked it up. According to 4 camera angles later reviewed in exhaustive detail in my courtroom, he examined it for approximately 11 seconds, turning it over in his palm. He did not pocket it. He did not check over his shoulder, the behavior any investigator will tell you is the first thing they look for in theft cases. He walked directly, at a normal pace, toward the nearest store employee he could find, a 19-year-old kiosk worker named Tyler Brooks, roughly 40 feet away. Tyler would later testify that Noah approached him and said, close to verbatim, "Excuse me, I found this on the floor by the bathroom. I don't know whose it is. Can you call whoever's in charge of lost stuff?" Tyler, unsure of the correct protocol for an item of this value, made what he called the worst decision of his short career. Rather than personally escorting Noah to security, he gestured vaguely toward the concourse and returned to his register. Noah did exactly what he was told. He walked, per the footage, directly toward the concourse, ring still held visibly in his open palm rather than concealed, a detail my courtroom returned to repeatedly, because it matters enormously to what kind of intent a person can reasonably be assumed to have. He was intercepted roughly 90 seconds later by a Meridian Square security contractor named Gerald Voss. Voss saw an 11-year-old boy in a jacket too small for him holding a diamond ring in the open, and made a decision in the span of perhaps 3 seconds that would ripple through the rest of that day, and through the rest of this case. He did not ask Noah what he was doing. He did not ask where the ring had come from. According to his own written incident report, filed that same afternoon, his first words to Noah were, "Hand it over right now and don't move." He then radioed for backup, physically restrained an 11-year-old child by the wrist hard enough to leave a bruise later documented by an intake nurse, and walked him to the mall security office, where Noah was held for close to 2 hours before local police were formally called. I want to be precise here. Noah Bennett was detained without being informed of any rights, without any attempt made to locate his guardian, for close to 2 hours, on the sole basis of being seen holding an item of value while young, while poorly dressed, and it became relevant later in ways I will address directly, while black. Denise Carter spent those same 2 hours in escalating panic, walking every aisle and corridor, calling Noah's name, before a sympathetic janitor finally directed her to the security office. By the time she arrived, local police had already been called based on a hastily summarized account rather than the actual footage, which no one had yet bothered to pull. A patrol officer formally arrested Noah on suspicion of theft. He was transported separately from Denise, who was not permitted to ride with him, to a juvenile holding facility, where he spent that Saturday night alone in a cell. Denise did not sleep. She sat in the facility parking lot past midnight because she was not permitted inside, calling every emergency number the county provided, until an attorney named Priya Anand agreed, well after 2 in the morning, to take the case pro bono after hearing barely 3 sentences of what happened. Priya would sit beside Noah at the defense table 11 days later. There was one more piece of this story that had not yet surfaced. The ring belonged to a 79-year-old woman named Margaret Ellsworth. She had removed it before washing her hands, set it on the shelf beside the sink out of a 52-year habit, and walked out without it, not realizing until she was 3 stores away. What was lost was not simply valuable. It was the last physical piece of a 52-year marriage to a man named Walter Ellsworth, who had proposed in 1974 with nearly his entire life savings of $412, and who had quietly upgraded the ring twice on their 25th and 50th anniversaries, without ever telling her in advance. Walter had died 7 months before the ring went missing. It wasn't until Priya Anand requested the mall's full footage and incident logs 4 days later, that anyone connected the found property sitting in a security office safe to the ring Margaret had reported missing that same afternoon, less than 200 feet away. That is the case that came before me. Noah walked into my courtroom beside Denise and Priya, small for 11, wearing a collared shirt Denise had ironed that morning and shoes she had polished the night before at her kitchen table at 11 at night, because she wanted him to walk in looking like a boy the world was proud of, whatever the world had decided to accuse him of that week. He did not swagger. He walked with his shoulders curled inward, the posture of a child who has learned that rooms full of authority rarely resolve in his favor. Called the case. Priya Anand entered a plea of not guilty and stated plainly that these charges should never have been filed in the first place. Officer Voss took the stand first. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a security uniform, not a police uniform, a distinction that mattered greatly, since private security contractors do not carry the same authority to detain a minor that a sworn officer does. He testified that he'd observed a juvenile subject behaving suspiciously. I asked him what specifically he considered suspicious. He said the boy was moving quickly and looking around, a description directly contradicted by Tyler Brooks's own account. I asked whether he had reviewed any footage before restraining a child. He had not. I asked whether he had asked Noah a single question first. He answered on the record, "I didn't feel like there was time to have a conversation about it. I asked whether, in 11 years of mall security, he could recall ever detaining an adult under similar circumstances. He could not. A loss prevention supervisor named Cheryl Danvers testified next, defending the mall's general policies. Priya's cross-examination walked her through the mall's own written protocol, a document Danvers herself had helped draft, which required staff to simply thank a person voluntarily reporting a found item, log its description, and escort it to lost and found. Nothing about restraint. Nothing about calling police, provided the individual cooperated, which every account confirmed Noah had. Priya then asked whether a child in pressed slacks rather than a second-hand jacket would have been treated the same way. The state objected as speculative. I allowed the question. Danvers declined to answer. I noted the declination for the record. We reviewed the footage together in silence. Noah approaching, examining the ring, walking calmly to Tyler, being pointed toward the concourse, walking exactly that direction with the ring still visible in his open palm, and then Voss's hand closing around his wrist hard enough that even on grainy footage, the flinch on Noah's face was unmistakable. Noah's own testimony was the heart of the case. I asked whether he'd thought even for a moment about keeping it. He answered honestly rather than defensively. Yes, for about 2 seconds, thinking of new shoes or clothes that fit, or helping Denise with bills he sometimes heard her worrying about late at night. Then he thought of his grandmother who used to tell him, "What is not yours will burn a hole in your pocket until you give it back, and what is yours will never need to be stolen to be kept." He said that even alone in that cell, wondering if he'd made a mistake, he still believed he'd do the same thing again because being scared afterward doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It just means the world can be unfair to people who make good ones. Margaret Ellsworth asked to testify even though the state hadn't planned to call her. She told the court about Walter, the $412, the 2 secret upgrades, his death 7 months earlier, holding her hand in his sleep. She wept openly on the stand, not the composed kind of weeping courtrooms sometimes see performed, but genuine, unrestrained grief. She turned to Noah directly. "That boy gave me back the only piece of my husband I still had, and this city put him in a cage for it. I have never in my life been more ashamed of an institution I have paid taxes to for 50 years. In my ruling, I dismissed both charges with prejudice and ordered the record sealed and expunged in its entirety, so no trace of that day would ever appear on a background check, a school application, anything he would build for himself as an adult. I said that every documented action Noah took that morning was consistent with honesty and inconsistent with theft, and that the only conduct deserving real scrutiny belonged to the adults responsible for him in that moment, a contractor who admitted under oath he didn't feel there was time to ask a single question, and a mall management structure that failed at every level to follow its own written protocol. I referred Voss's conduct to the state licensing board for review, and ordered a formal letter sent to Meridian Square's management recommending full retraining of security personnel around unconscious bias. I told Noah directly that his grandmother had given him something more valuable than any ring, a compass pointing toward what was right even when nobody was watching, even when the world punished him for following it anyway, and that this court owed him an apology on behalf of every adult who failed him that day. Margaret wasn't finished. She rose without being called and asked to address the court once more. She walked to Noah slowly, cane tapping against the floor, and opened a small velvet box, not the diamond ring which remained logged as evidence, but a simple gold band, the very first ring Walter had ever given her, an $11 pawn shop promise ring bought when they were both 19 with no money at all, kept in a drawer for 56 years after it was replaced. She told Noah she wanted him to have it, not as a reward, she specified, not as payment, because what he did should never be something a person gets paid for, it should simply be who they are, but because he had already proven at 11 years old the exact same quiet integrity she had spent 52 years loving in her husband. During an earlier recess, I had made 2 calls of my own. The first opened a scholarship account through a local trust for children aging out of foster care, seeded that same day with a contribution I made personally, so Noah would not start from zero at 18 with nothing behind him. The second was to a caseworker supervisor I'd worked alongside for 15 years. I'd learned Denise's adoption application for Noah, filed 8 months earlier, had stalled in a paperwork backlog through no fault of her own. I directed my clerk to draft a formal letter requesting expedited review. I announced both to the courtroom before closing, not as part of the ruling itself, but as the actions of someone who had spent a morning listening to a story that deserved more than a dismissal to properly close it. Denise was openly crying. Margaret had taken Noah's hand, the small gold band resting in his palm. Priya Anand, who I have watched argue cases with almost unshakable calm, had to step back from the table to collect herself. 3 weeks later, Denise's adoption application was formally approved. The finalization hearing took place 2 doors down from my own courtroom. Noah Bennett officially became Noah Carter. 2 months after that, I received a letter in careful, deliberate handwriting. He wrote that he wanted to thank me for believing him, and for what I'd said about his grandmother, because no adult had ever told him before that what she taught him actually mattered. He wrote that his mom, he corrected himself immediately in the letter, cried happy tears almost every day since the adoption, and that hearing the word mom out loud still felt strange, but less like a mistake each time and more like something that had simply been true the whole time, waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He wrote that Margaret had invited them to dinner twice, shown him old photographs of Walter, and started teaching him woodworking, because Walter had loved building small wooden toys in his garage and she thought he'd like knowing a piece of his old workbench was being used again. He wrote that he still wore the gold ring on a chain rather than his finger, because his hands were still growing, and that he thought about it every single day. He closed the letter. I used to think doing the right thing when you were scared was supposed to feel brave. Now I think it just feels like being scared and doing it anyway, and afterward if you are lucky some of the scared turns into something else. Thank you for giving me the something else. Just over 2 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon with no case involving him at all, Noah Carter walked back into my courthouse, 13 now, noticeably taller, in a jacket that actually fit, bought new. He was there for a school project on community heroes, and had asked his teacher whether he could interview a judge instead of a firefighter, because the person who'd changed his life most was someone who had simply listened to him properly, for the first time, in a room where most people had already decided who he was before he opened his mouth. We spoke for close to an hour. He told me Margaret had become, in his words, something like a grandmother he chose rather than one life happened to give him, and that she'd started paying for a weekend woodworking class using the very tools Walter once used, because watching Noah's hands learn something Walter's hands had loved felt like a piece of her husband continuing on in a way she'd stopped believing was possible after he passed. He told me the scholarship account kept growing, and that his mother kept a folder, in the same kitchen drawer where she'd once ironed his shirt collar, of every report card he'd brought home since, so he could look back one day and see the whole shape of who he'd become. He told me he'd started thinking seriously about law. Not for the robe or the gavel, he was careful to clarify, but because he'd learned that a room most people fear can also become the room where truth finally gets to matter more than assumptions. I have thought often, in the years since, about what this case actually taught me beyond one boy, one ring, one deeply unjust arrest. I think about how easily this story could have ended differently. An overworked public defender pushing for a quick plea, footage never requested, a sealed record Noah would carry into adulthood with no chance to correct the injustice inside it.